Terrorism destroys those who practice it. As they try to extinguish life in others, the light within them dies. Modern international terrorism stems from Palestinian secular movements in the late 1960s. The goal of these movements was to combat Israeli influence and actions in the Arab world. One such movement culminated in the first major international terrorist attack in 1972 at the Munich Olympic Games in Germany. The attack began when 8 Palestinian terrorists broke into the Olympic Village, killing 2 Israeli athletes immediately and taking the remaining 9 team members hostage, all of whom later died during a shootout with police. Following the attack, the United States State Department Bureau for Diplomatic Security reported 2 major changes in how the U.S. would protect American diplomats around the world.
Good evening. I'm Howard K. Smith in Washington. Harry Reasoner's on vacation. These are tonight's headlines. Israel, mourning its dead and angered at the killers, prepares to hold a state funeral tomorrow for the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games are resumed after memorial services attended by 80,000 persons are held in Munich. President Nixon directs the Secretary of State to consult with other nations on international security measures against terrorists, and both houses of Congress by unanimous vote adopt a resolution calling for world isolation of any nation encouraging terrorism.
Diplomatic security would now be a major foreign policy concern, and security would now focus on actively using personnel and technology to fight terrorism, as opposed to the passive tactic of evaluation it had been employing. However, the most far-reaching effect was how it molded American public perception of terrorism. Terrorists became, as history professor Paul Thomas Chamberlain said, bloodthirsty fanatics bent on spreading destruction and anarchy, with whom negotiations were futile and immoral. Even as State Department officials and United Nations delegates warned that Palestinian peacemakers needed to be involved in the peace process, the U.S. government labeled all armed Palestinian groups as terrorists. It was this view and President Nixon's decision to not recognize the underlying grievances that Palestinians had, which ultimately furthered terrorist organizations and perpetuated further violence. Following this attack, the United States had yet to face international terrorism in a direct confrontation. That ended with the Iran hostage crisis of 1979, in which the United States was forced to not only take a stand on its policy towards terrorism, but come to terms with religious-based terrorism movements. Described as the United States' first brush with political Islam due to the large involvement with the Islamic demographic, the diplomatic crisis began when a group of Iranian students storming the U.S. Embassy in Tehran took a group of Americans hostage. The students, who supported the Iranian Revolution of 1978, the events that involved the overthrow of the Pahlavi dynasty under King Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, which were supported by the United States, captured 52 American diplomats and citizens and held them at hostage for 444 days. Initially, there were 66 hostages until 14 victims got released in November 1979, with the exception of one person named Richard Queen, who was released in 1980 due to his deteriorating health in the containment. This commitment was considered an entanglement for the American media, with President Jimmy Carter saying that the hostages are victims of terrorism and anarchy, which can be reworded as Iran being a land of extremism. Our foreign policy is established as a systematic way to deal with issues that may arise with other countries, such as dealing with domestic hostages in international countries. The event encouraged the initiation of 2 unsuccessful rescue missions, which led to the deaths of 7 American military men who tried to support foreign policy through negotiations with the Iranians and to free the hostages. The failure of the rescue attempts led to our reluctance of sending more soldiers into the Iranian territory. Iran and the United States, damaged by the loss of 7 people, neutralized the crisis when Iran released all hostages on January 20, 1981, after a series of negotiations by President Carter. In 1982, American, French, and Italian troops arrived in Lebanon. They were intended to oversee the ceasefire between Israel and Palestine. Conditions in the area were unstable due to the Lebanese Civil War, which was occurring at the time. On October 23, 1983, a dump truck holding over 12,000 pounds of explosives ran through the front gates of the American Marine Barracks in Beirut. This initial attack destroyed the 4-story building and killed 241 Marines and sailors. Minutes later, a second attack occurred at the French barracks in Beirut. This building crumbled, crushing and killing 58 French and American soldiers. After the dust settled, 299 people had been killed. The Beirut bombings, as well as other suicide bombings, marked a change in terrorist and militia strategies against the United States. Using a vehicle of transportation to deliver the explosives was not new. However, the suicide tactics would continue to threaten Western societies, as seen in the 9/11 attacks. The Beirut attacks revealed the vulnerabilities of the United States and other world superpowers. The suicide bombings made it hard to retaliate, as it could be kept anonymous. There was little evidence to trace back to which organization was responsible for the Beirut bombings. This change required new thinking in how to prevent terrorist attacks. Admiral John Poindexter, a retired Navy officer, became Deputy of National Security Advisor under the Reagan administration. Upon request, he was brought in to change the way the United States dealt with terrorist attacks. Serious updates were made to the Situation Room and Crisis Management Center, most of it being new technology that would allow the United States to link together clues and help to prevent attacks. Poindexter also commanded the Crisis Pre-Planning Group, which became essential to the anti-terrorist campaign. After the Beirut attacks, it was unclear if Ronald Reagan had a solid policy for security of Lebanon and the United States troops stationed there. 4 months later, Reagan announced that the United States was pulling the main force out of Lebanon, leaving a small amount to guard the United States Embassy. As international terrorism kept evolving, another large event that took place was Pan Am Flight 103 in 1988, otherwise known as the Lockerbie disaster. Flight 103 took off from London, England on December 21, 1988. After 38 minutes of flying, the plane had exploded 31,000 feet above ground level over Lockerbie, Scotland. 259 of the 747 people on board were killed, in addition to 11 people seriously injured. Upon investigation in 1990, United States and British investigators had found fragments of a man-made circuit board and timer and concluded that the plane did not explode from a mechanical issue, but rather a bomb. This bomb was later found to be a Toshiba cassette recorder that contained internal Semtex explosives and which was hidden within a suitcase on the plane. Terrorism tactics had been evolving, as this attack showed innovation and pretentious planning to execute. In November of 1991, 2 Libyan men were charged with creating and implementing the bomb, including Abdelbesset Ali Mohammed al-Magrahi and Al-Amin Khalifa Fama. The CIA and FBI later concluded that both suspects were Libyan intelligence agents that worked for Libyan Arab Airlines in Malta and had access to Flight 103 and the luggage upon it. 4 years later, the United States, Britain, and Libya all reached agreement to hand both suspects over to the United Nations and try both suspects in the Netherlands, a neutral land. In 1999, 11 years after the explosion of Flight 103, United States and Libyan representatives met to discuss removing the sanctions placed by the United Nations, and this was proved to be unsuccessful. At the trial in 2001, al-Magrahi was found guilty and Fama was found not guilty. Al-Magrahi was sentenced to serve a minimum of 27 years for the deaths of 259 individuals. The sanctions placed upon Libya by the United Nations were removed in 2003 after President Gaddafi agreed to pay $2.7 billion as proper compensation for the families of the Lockerbie disaster. The United States resumed direct diplomatic ties with Libya in 2004, 16 years after the explosion of Flight 103. As Islamic religious and secular terrorism has evolved since the first major incident at the Munich Olympic Games, the encounters that the United States has had with various countries has drastically changed as well. Many Western nations have bonded together over time to combat terrorism against the Middle East, such as France and the United States during the Beirut bombings and Britain and the United States during the Lockerbie disaster, as previously, terrorism was a very individual issue. As nations have continued to bond and support one another on both sides of the world, one can argue that the war on terrorism has become terrorism.